The padlock on the barn door had rusted shut over 23 years, its mechanism frozen by weather and time and something that looked like deliberate neglect. Sarah Bennett stood in front of it with bolt cutters borrowed from her mother's toolshed, her hands shaking not from the March cold but from the weight of a promise she was about to break. Her mother's last words had been specific, delivered from a hospital bed 3 weeks before cancer claimed her. "Don't open the red barn, Sarah. Please. Just let it stand." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But the property taxes were due in 45 days, and the real estate agent had been clear that potential buyers would want access to all structures before making offers on the 100-acre farm that had been in Sarah's family for 4 generations. The house could be sold as is, the equipment barn was already inventoried, but the red barn, sealed since Sarah was 12 years old, forbidden territory her entire childhood, that mystery would lower the property value significantly if it remained inaccessible. Sarah's 15-year-old daughter Emma stood beside her, phone in hand, documenting everything the way her generation documented everything. Her dark hair pulled back in the same ponytail Sarah had worn at that age, the resemblance to her grandmother Margaret so striking that Sarah sometimes had to look twice to remember which generation she was seeing. "Grandma really never told you what was in there?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality she used when discussing Margaret, the grandmother she'd known only in the final difficult years of illness. "Never. Just that it was sealed for good reasons and should stay that way." Sarah positioned the bolt cutters around the padlock shackle, feeling like she was about to open something that should remain closed. "She made me promise when I was your age, made your Aunt Rachel promise, made everyone who ever asked about it promise not to open it. But she's gone now," Emma said, her voice carrying the practical logic of teenagers who hadn't learned yet that some promises transcended death. "And we need to sell the farm. We can't just leave a mystery barn sealed forever because Grandma had some secret she wouldn't explain." The bolt cutters bit through the rusted metal with surprising ease, the padlock falling to the ground with a sound that felt far too loud in the quiet morning. Sarah stood there holding the tool, staring at the door that had been closed for 23 years, thinking about her mother's face when she'd extracted that deathbed promise, the desperation in Margaret's eyes suggesting the secret behind this door mattered more than anything else she'd kept private. She pulled the door open slowly, hinges screaming in protest after decades of disuse, revealing darkness that smelled of dust and old wood and something else, something that might have been paint or chemicals or just the accumulated scent of time itself, of years passing in a sealed space where air had been still for longer than Emma had been alive. As Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dimness, she saw what her mother had sealed away, and her breath caught so hard in her chest that Emma grabbed her arm in concern, thinking her mother was having some kind of medical emergency. The barn wasn't empty. It was full, completely, overwhelmingly full, of paintings. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stacked against walls and hanging from beams and organized on shelves built specifically to hold canvas. Landscapes and portraits and abstract pieces, works in oil and watercolor and mixed media, covering every available surface in a riot of color and form and artistic vision that Sarah had never known her mother possessed. Her mother, Margaret Bennett, had been a farmer's wife, a practical woman who'd raised 2 daughters while managing a working farm alongside her husband, who'd worn the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation and whose hands had been permanently stained with soil from decades of agricultural work. Art had never been part of her identity, had never been mentioned as an interest or hobby or abandoned dream. Sarah's entire childhood, her mother had been defined by work, livestock and crops and equipment maintenance and the endless demands of keeping a 100-acre farm operational through economic pressures that had driven most of their neighbors out of business. But this barn told a different story. This barn revealed a woman who'd created beauty on a scale that suggested not hobby but obsession, who'd spent decades making art while the world thought she was just a farmer's wife who kept one barn mysteriously locked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah walked deeper into the space, Emma following close behind, both of them silent with shock at the scope of what they were seeing. The paintings were organized chronologically based on the dates marked in small, precise handwriting in the corners, starting from 1978, the year Sarah was born, and continuing through to just months before her mother's diagnosis in late 2023. 45 years of work, produced in secret, hidden in a sealed barn that nobody was supposed to open. The early paintings were tentative, the work of someone learning technique through trial and error, but even these showed promise and passion that went beyond casual dabbling. By the mid-80s, the quality had improved dramatically, the compositions more confident, the colors more assured, the brushwork showing the kind of control that came from thousands of hours of practice. The 90s work showed genuine mastery, pieces that wouldn't have looked out of place in serious galleries, that demonstrated understanding of light and shadow and emotional resonance that came from somewhere deeper than technical skill alone. Sarah found herself standing in front of a portrait dated April 1985, her 7-year-old face rendered in oils with such love and detail that she felt tears rising before she'd consciously processed what she was looking at. She remembered being 7, remembered that spring, remembered her mother being constantly busy with farm work during planting season when every hour of daylight mattered. She'd never imagined that Margaret had found time to paint during that period, had never suspected that her mother was stealing hours from sleep or early mornings to create something this elaborate, this carefully observed, this obviously created from a place of profound maternal love. The painting captured her sitting on the porch steps of the farmhouse, holding a barn cat, sunlight filtering through the leaves of the oak tree that still stood in the yard. Every detail was rendered with attention that suggested hours of work, the pattern of her dress, the expression on her face showing some emotion Sarah couldn't quite name from this distance, the way light fell across the weathered boards of the porch. This wasn't a snapshot converted to paint. This was observation, was study, was her mother seeing her daughter and choosing to preserve that scene through painstaking artistic labor. "Mom, look at this," Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. She was standing in front of a series of paintings from 2001, abstract works that showed dark colors and violent brushstrokes, emotions rendered in paint rather than represented by recognizable images. The pieces felt raw, almost painful to look at, grief and rage worked out through art instead of words. Sarah joined her daughter, recognizing immediately what she was seeing. These were from the year her father had died suddenly of a heart attack in May, leaving Margaret to run the farm alone while grieving a husband of 28 years. Sarah had been there for the funeral, had stayed a week helping with arrangements and immediate farm tasks, had thought her mother was handling things with the stoic strength she'd always demonstrated when faced with difficulty. These paintings told a different story. These paintings revealed grief too intense and complicated to speak aloud, rage at being left alone, sorrow that couldn't be contained in the role of composed widow managing practical necessities. Her mother had been devastated, had been falling apart, but had done it here in this sealed barn where nobody would witness her breaking, where she could express through color and form what she couldn't allow herself to express in the world outside. She was suffering, Emma said quietly. That whole year after Grandpa died, she was in here painting this. They spent hours exploring the barn's contents, finding self-portraits that showed Margaret aging across decades, landscapes of the farm in different seasons and weathers, still lives that demonstrated technical skill most professional artists would envy. There were sketchbooks too, dozens of them, filled with studies and practice work and notes about technique and color theory written in her mother's precise handwriting, evidence of someone who'd taken her craft seriously, who'd studied and learned and developed her vision with the kind of dedication that required discipline beyond casual interest. Emma found a painting from 2015 that showed Sarah and Emma together, a double portrait based on a photograph Sarah remembered taking at Emma's 8th birthday party. In the photo, they'd been smiling at the camera, arms around each other, celebrating in the backyard with cake and presents. In the painting, Margaret had transformed that snapshot into something more, had captured something about their relationship, about the bond between mother and daughter, about love and continuity across generations. She'd made them beautiful, had seen them with an artist's eye that found composition and meaning in a casual birthday photograph. She painted us, Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. She made us into art. Made us matter in this way we never knew about. Sarah looked at her daughter looking at the painting, seeing 3 generations connected through artistic vision that had been hidden for 45 years, through love expressed in brushstrokes rather than words, through a secret life that was only now becoming visible. Her mother had created an entire world in this barn, had been someone entirely different from the practical farmer's wife everyone had known, had cultivated talent and passion and artistic vision while presenting to the world the image of someone who had no time or interest in such frivolous pursuits. As afternoon light shifted through the barn's cracks and gaps in the siding, creating new patterns across the stored paintings, Sarah found a letter taped to an easel that stood in the barn's far corner, positioned near a window that would have provided north light, the kind of light artists preferred because it remained consistent throughout the day. Her name was written across the envelope in her mother's handwriting, the paper aged but preserved carefully, obviously placed there with intention and forethought. She opened it with trembling hands while Emma watched with the kind of focused attention given to moments that might prove significant, both of them understanding somehow that this letter might explain what they'd found, might make sense of 45 years of secret creation. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, you've opened the barn despite my asking you not to. I'm not angry. I knew the promise wouldn't hold forever, that eventually practical necessity would override dying wishes. Property needs to be sold, structures need to be accessed, adult children need to make sensible decisions about inheritances even when those decisions contradict their mother's irrational requests. I'm almost relieved, honestly, that you'll finally understand what I couldn't explain while alive, what I never had the courage to share even when sharing might have brought us closer. I started painting the year you were born. A few months after you arrived, I realized my life had become completely consumed by caretaking, for you, for the farm, for your father who needed a wife who could work alongside him rather than a woman with artistic pretensions that didn't contribute to the family's economic survival. I loved you desperately, loved him, loved this land with an intensity that surprised me, but I needed something that was mine alone, something beyond the endless demands of agricultural life and motherhood and being the kind of wife a working farmer required. So I started stealing hours. Early mornings before anyone woke, late nights after everyone slept, stolen moments when you were napping or your father was in the far fields with equipment that would keep him occupied for hours. I taught myself from library books at first, then from mail-order instruction manuals, practiced until my hands ached and my eyes burned from the kerosene lanterns I used so nobody would see light in the barn and wonder what I was doing. I created because creating was the only thing that kept me from disappearing entirely into the roles everyone needed me to play. I was a good mother to you and Rachel, was a good wife to your father, was a competent farm manager who kept our operation viable when others were failing. But I was also an artist, and being an artist required this separation, this secret space where I could be someone other than mother and wife and farmer. I sealed the barn in 2001, right after your father died. You asked if you could help go through his things, sort his workshop, clean out the spaces he'd occupied. I said no, said I needed to do it alone, said grief was private and you needed to respect that. The truth was I needed to protect this space, this secret, this part of me that nobody knew existed. Your father never knew about the painting. In 28 years of marriage, I never told him, never let him suspect that I had a life separate from our shared life. Never admitted that I needed something he couldn't provide or understand. The guilt about that secrecy was crushing sometimes. He was a good man, deserved a wife who was fully present rather than one who was constantly stealing hours for secret pursuits. But I couldn't stop. I tried, several times over the years, tried to be content with just being wife and mother and farmer. But I'd last maybe 2 weeks before the hunger became unbearable, before I'd find myself back in here mixing paints and losing hours to the work that felt more essential than breathing. I should have told you. Should have shared this with you and Rachel, should have let you see that your mother was more than just the competent woman who kept the farm running and made sure you had clean clothes and hot meals. But shame is a powerful thing, Sarah. Shame about wanting something beyond the life I had. Shame about spending money on paint and canvas when farm equipment needed repairs and you girls needed school supplies. Shame about being someone I never showed the world. Shame about the dishonesty of hiding such a fundamental part of myself from everyone who thought they knew me. I'm dying now. The doctors give me weeks, maybe a month if I'm unlucky. And I can't bring myself to destroy the work even though keeping it feels like vanity, like I'm assuming it matters enough to preserve. So I'm leaving it for you to find, eventually, when I'm not around to see your face when you realize your mother was a stranger, was someone you never actually knew despite living with her for 18 years and visiting regularly for 20 more after that. Do with it what you want, sell it, destroy it, donate it to some charity auction, keep it moldering in this barn for another generation. It's yours now, along with the farm and the equipment and the burden of deciding what to do with property that's worth less than its tax liability, with a legacy that's more complicated than I had any right to make it. I loved you completely, Sarah. I love you still, wherever I am when you read this. The paintings don't change that, they're just evidence that love and motherhood and duty sometimes exist alongside hungers that can't be satisfied by the roles we're assigned, that people are more complicated than the versions of themselves they show the world, that your mother was both the woman you knew and someone entirely different, and both versions were real and true and loved you with everything they had. I'm sorry I never had the courage to let you see me completely. I'm sorry you're finding out this way, after I'm gone, when you can't ask questions or have conversations or understand the woman who created all this in secret for 45 years. But I couldn't figure out any other way to be both the mother you needed and the artist I needed to be, so I chose secrecy and separation and a sealed barn that you're now standing in, reading a letter from a woman who was your mother but who you never actually knew. Forgive me if you can. Remember me if you're willing. And maybe, if you have any mercy for the complicated woman who raised you, don't destroy what I made even if you can't understand why I made it or why I hid it or why I'm asking you through a letter to see me as I actually was rather than as I pretended to be. Your mother, Margaret Bennett. Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, Emma reading over her shoulder with her own tears falling onto the pages, both of them processing the revelation that Margaret had been someone entirely different from who they'd believed, that the practical, stoic farmer's wife had been hiding an entire artistic identity for 45 years, that love and secrecy and shame had coexisted in their mother and grandmother in ways that rewrote everything they thought they'd understood about her. She thought we wouldn't understand, Emma said finally, her voice thick with tears. Thought we'd judge her or think less of her or be angry about the secrecy. But I'm not angry. I'm just sad she felt like she had to hide this, like being an artist was something to be ashamed of instead of proud of. Sarah pulled her daughter close, both of them standing in the barn full of Margaret's hidden life, surrounded by 45 years of work that nobody had known existed until 3 hours ago when Sarah had cut through a rusted padlock and opened a door that was supposed to stay closed forever. The barn that had been forbidden suddenly made sense, not as shame exactly but as refuge, as evidence of a woman who'd found a way to be more than one thing even when being more than one thing required absolute secrecy. We can't sell this, Emma said fiercely, pulling back to look at her mother. We can't let someone turn this into storage or tear it down to make the property more marketable. This is Grandma's legacy, her real legacy, the thing that mattered enough that she did it in secret for 45 years. Sarah looked around the barn at thousands of paintings, at evidence of her mother's hidden life rendered in oil and watercolor and passionate brushstrokes, at work that had been created with such discipline and dedication that it had accumulated into something overwhelming in its scope. The real estate agent wanted the farm sold as quickly as possible, wanted everything wrapped up and transferred and settled so Sarah could return to her life in Des Moines and Rachel could stay in Denver and neither of them would have to deal with the burden of property they didn't want and couldn't afford to maintain. But this barn wasn't just property anymore. It was testimony, was revelation, was a complete rewriting of everything Sarah had believed about her mother and about the life Margaret had lived. Selling it, letting someone clear it out or tear it down or convert it to conventional storage, that felt like betraying the woman who'd trusted Sarah enough to leave this discovery, who'd preserved her work carefully even while being too ashamed to share it while alive. That evening, after they'd locked the barn again with a new padlock, protecting rather than concealing this time, Sarah made calls. First to her sister Rachel in Denver, telling her to get on a plane immediately regardless of work obligations, that she needed to see what their mother had hidden in the red barn. Rachel argued, said she couldn't just drop everything, said whatever was in the barn could wait. Sarah said no, it couldn't wait, that this was important enough to justify the cost of a last-minute flight and the disruption to Rachel's schedule as a corporate attorney who billed by the hour. Then she called an art appraiser in Kansas City, someone named Catherine Torres who specialized in outsider art and hidden collections, someone who might understand what they'd found and what it might mean beyond sentimental value. Catherine listened to Sarah's description, asked pointed questions about quantity and quality and dates, then said she could be there in 2 days, that this sounded like something worth examining personally rather than assessing from photographs. Rachel arrived the next morning, skeptical and annoyed about the emergency summons, clearly expecting some minor discovery that Sarah had overreacted to. She was 41, 3 years younger than Sarah, and she'd built a life in Denver that had nothing to do with their Iowa roots, had changed her last name when she married and changed it back when she divorced but kept using it anyway because Bennett sounded too rural for her urban legal career. She wore expensive clothes and carried the kind of confidence that came from billing $800 an hour, and she clearly thought this emergency farm visit was beneath her professional dignity. Sarah led her into the barn without explanation, just opened the door and let Rachel see what was inside, watched her sister's face transform from irritation to shock to something approaching awe as she processed the scope of what their mother had hidden. Rachel stood frozen for a long moment, then walked slowly into the barn like someone entering a sacred space, her expensive shoes clicking on the wood floor that Margaret had walked for 45 years while creating in secret. She moved from painting to painting with increasing wonder, her professional composure cracking as she encountered her own face rendered in oils from various ages, landscapes she recognized from their childhood, abstract pieces that suggested emotions she'd never imagined her practical mother feeling. She stopped in front of a portrait dated October 1992, her 17-year-old face captured with such careful attention that it was clear Margaret had spent hours on this piece. Rachel had been angry that fall, Sarah remembered, angry about being stuck on the farm, angry about their parents' resistance to her college plans, angry about the limitations of rural life and determined to escape to somewhere that mattered. The portrait captured that anger, showed it in her expression, but also showed something else, showed Margaret seeing her daughter's rage and pain and desperate need to leave, seeing it and understanding it and preserving it through artistic labor that suggested empathy rather than judgment. "My God," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face, her professional composure completely shattered. "How did we not know? How did we live with her our entire childhood and never suspect she had this whole other life? Because she never told us." Sarah handed her sister the letter, watched Rachel read it with increasing emotion, both of them crying by the time Rachel reached Margaret's closing plea for forgiveness and understanding. "She thought we'd judge her," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "Thought we'd be angry about the secrecy or disappointed that she wasn't the person we thought she was. But I'm not angry. I'm devastated that she felt like she had to hide this, like being an artist was something shameful instead of remarkable." Catherine Torres arrived 2 days later, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the kind of intensity that suggested she took art seriously even when it came from unexpected sources. She'd spent 30 years documenting undiscovered artists in outsider collections, had written books about art created outside traditional institutional structures, had developed a reputation for recognizing quality and significance that others might dismiss because it came from the wrong contexts or the wrong creators. She walked through the barn with careful attention, examining paintings, checking dates, studying technique with the kind of focus that suggested she was seeing something important. She didn't speak for the first 2 hours except to ask occasional questions about Margaret's background or whether there were any records of her having received formal training. Sarah and Rachel followed her silently, watching a professional evaluate work they were still processing emotionally, trying to understand their mother's secret through someone else's expert assessment. Finally, Catherine pulled out a painting from 1998, a landscape of the farm in autumn that showed technical mastery and emotional depth, and turned to face the sisters with an expression that was carefully controlled but couldn't quite hide her excitement. "Your mother was self-taught?" she asked, though Sarah had already confirmed this earlier. "As far as we know. She never mentioned taking classes or studying with anyone. The letter she left suggests she taught herself from library books and mail-order instruction manuals." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, studying the landscape with attention that suggested she was seeing something beyond just painted canvas. "This is museum-quality work. Not good for an amateur, not impressive for someone self-taught, this is genuinely excellent by any standard. The composition is sophisticated, the understanding of light and atmosphere shows deep observation and technical control, the emotional resonance is the kind that separates competent work from art that actually matters." She gestured around the barn at the thousands of paintings. "And she produced this volume over 45 years? While running a farm and raising children? Apparently, Sarah said, still trying to process what it meant that her mother had been this talented, this dedicated, this capable of sustaining secret creative work on this scale while also being a devoted mother and wife and farmer. Catherine set down the landscape carefully, her expression showing the kind of controlled excitement that experts displayed when encountering something significant. I need to spend more time examining the full collection, but my preliminary assessment is that you've found a major discovery in terms of outsider art and hidden artistic production. Your mother's work deserves serious attention, deserves to be seen by people beyond just family, deserves recognition for what it is, evidence of remarkable talent and discipline sustained over nearly half a century. Over the following week, Catherine worked with Sarah and Rachel to catalog the paintings, creating a preliminary inventory that documented over 2,000 finished pieces spanning 45 years, plus hundreds of sketches and studies, plus journals where Margaret had written about her process and thoughts about art and the tension between her creative hunger and her family obligations. Each discovery added new dimensions to their understanding of Margaret, revealed new complexities in a woman they'd thought they'd known completely. The journals were particularly revelatory. Margaret had written about the guilt she felt spending money on art supplies when the farm budget was tight, about stealing hours from sleep to paint because daytime belonged to work and family, about the fear that someone would discover her secret and judge her for having desires beyond the roles she'd been assigned. But she'd also written about the joy of creation, about how painting made her feel whole in ways nothing else did, about finding meaning in artistic work that went beyond the practical satisfactions of successful farming or good parenting. One entry from 1989 particularly struck Sarah. Sarah is 11 now, Rachel 8. They're good girls, happy and healthy and doing well in school. I'm proud of being their mother, proud of the childhood we're giving them on this farm. But sometimes I look at them and feel terror that they'll grow up thinking this is all I was, just mom, just the farmer's wife who kept things running. I want them to know someday that I was more than that, but I'm too ashamed to show them, too afraid they'll see my artistic ambitions as selfishness or evidence that being their mother wasn't enough for me. Maybe after I'm dead, maybe then they'll find this barn and understand that people are complicated, that I love them completely while also needing something separate from them, something that was mine alone. Rachel read this passage and broke down crying, overcome with the realization that their mother had wanted them to know but had been too ashamed to tell them while alive, had left this discovery as inheritance but had been too burdened by guilt to share it when sharing might have actually meant something to their relationship. Catherine spent 10 days examining the collection before making her formal recommendation. She sat with Sarah and Rachel in the farmhouse kitchen where Margaret had made thousands of meals across 40 years, where she'd been the practical mother who kept the family fed while also being the secret artist who stole hours to create work that nobody knew existed. Your mother's work is significant, Catherine said, choosing her words carefully. Not just personally significant to your family, but artistically significant in terms of outsider art and hidden creative production. She developed a distinctive vision and serious technical skills entirely on her own, created an enormous body of work while living a completely separate life as farmer and mother, documented her artistic journey through journals that provide insight into creative process and the psychological costs of secret production. This is the kind of discovery that deserves public attention, that should be shared with people beyond just the family. What are you suggesting? Sarah asked, though she suspected where this was heading. I'm suggesting a retrospective exhibition, a serious museum show that presents your mother's work to the public and tells her story honestly, the secret production, the hidden talent, the complexity of being someone privately while presenting a completely different identity publicly. I think a regional museum would be very interested in hosting this, possibly even a larger institution once they understand the scope and quality of what she created. Rachel was nodding, her legal mind already working through logistics. We'd need to be selective, obviously. Show enough to demonstrate the range and evolution without overwhelming viewers. Tell the story in a way that honors both her talent and her reasons for hiding it. Over the next 4 months, Sarah and Rachel worked with Catherine to organize a retrospective of Margaret Bennett's work, selecting 200 paintings that span the entire 45-year period and showed the evolution from tentative beginner to confident master. They partnered with the Midwest Regional Art Museum in Kansas City, an institution that specialized in outsider art and undiscovered artists, creating an exhibition they titled Hidden Harvests, The Secret Art of Margaret Bennett. The promotional materials told Margaret's story honestly, farmer's wife who'd painted in secret for 45 years, who'd developed significant talent while keeping it completely hidden from family and community, who'd left behind a barn full of work that rewrote her legacy. Catherine had written the catalog essay, placing Margaret's work in the context of other outsider artists and examining how rural women often cultivated secret creative lives alongside their public roles as caregivers and laborers. Sarah spent weeks preparing for the opening, working with the museum to install paintings, reviewing interpretive text, ensuring the exhibition honored her mother's complexity rather than reducing her to a simple narrative of hidden talent discovered after death. Emma helped document everything, creating social media content that attracted attention from art critics and outsider art enthusiasts, people who appreciated stories about undiscovered artists whose work challenged assumptions about who made art and why. The night before the exhibition opened, Sarah stood alone in the gallery looking at her mother's work displayed professionally, lit properly, given the kind of serious attention it deserved. The paintings looked different here than they had in the barn, more powerful somehow, their quality more obvious when freed from the dust and darkness and secrecy of their hiding place. She stopped in front of the portrait of herself at age 7, the piece that had first broken her heart with its evidence of love expressed through stolen hours and careful brushstrokes. Looking at it now, in proper museum lighting, she could see details she'd missed initially, the careful attention Margaret had paid to capturing not just her physical appearance but something about her personality, the love evident in every brushstroke, the way her mother had seen beauty in her daughter and preserved it through skill and patience and artistic labor that nobody had known was happening. Rachel found her there, both sisters standing side by side looking at evidence of their mother's hidden life, processing the fact that the woman they'd thought they'd known completely had been someone entirely different in the red barn that was supposed to stay sealed forever. "Do you think she wanted this?" Rachel asked quietly. Public display, strangers examining her work, critics writing about her, her secret becoming the most public thing about her. "I think she wanted to be seen," Sarah said slowly, working through thoughts she'd been developing over months of preparation. Maybe not while she was alive. Maybe not in a way that would have complicated the life she'd built as farmer's wife and mother. But she preserved everything, dated everything, kept it organized and protected with the kind of care that suggests she believed it mattered, that someday someone should see it. Leaving it for us to find, that was giving permission, I think. Permission to see her completely, not just the parts she felt safe showing while alive. The exhibition opened on a Saturday in October, the anniversary of Margaret's birth, drawing crowds that surprised the museum staff and validated Catherine's assessment that this was a significant discovery deserving serious attention. Art critics came, collectors came, academics studying outsider art and women's hidden creative labor came. But mostly, regular people came, farmers and rural women and people who recognized something of themselves in Margaret's story, who understood what it meant to cultivate secret lives alongside public roles, who knew what it was to be more than one thing even when the world only saw one dimension. Sarah watched strangers connect with her mother's work, heard them discuss technique and emotional depth and the courage it took to create for 45 years without recognition, heard them share their own stories about hidden talents and secret pursuits, the ways they'd carved out space for themselves within lives defined primarily by caretaking and labor and responsibilities to others. Her mother's story had become larger than one woman's secret, had become representative of something broader about creative hunger and the cost of roles that didn't leave room for personal vision. Emma spent the opening interviewing visitors for a documentary she was creating about her grandmother, capturing responses to the work and collecting stories about people's own hidden creative lives. She'd been profoundly shaped by the discovery, had started painting herself after seeing what her grandmother had created, had developed her own relationship with art that honored Margaret's legacy while being distinctly her own. As evening settled over the museum and the opening reception continued, Sarah found herself standing in front of one of her mother's final paintings, created just months before her cancer diagnosis in late 2023. It was a landscape of the farm at sunset, the fields golden with late summer light, the barn silhouetted against fading sky, the whole scene rendered with the kind of attention that came from profound love of place, from decades of seeing this landscape in different weathers and seasons and capturing it through artistic vision that transformed documentation into something that expressed emotion rather than just recording appearance. Catherine joined her, both women quiet for a moment before she spoke. "Your mother's work is getting serious attention beyond just this exhibition. I've had inquiries from collectors interested in purchasing pieces, other museums wanting to borrow work for shows focused on outsider artists or women's hidden creative production, even a publisher interested in doing a major book of her paintings with essays about her life and work. This isn't just a regional story anymore, this is significant art that deserves national recognition." Sarah felt overwhelmed, proud and sad in equal measure. Her mother had died thinking nobody would ever see this work, had spent her final months knowing the barn held 45 years of secret creation that she was too ashamed to share, had left this discovery as inheritance but had died before seeing it receive the recognition it deserved. She would have been terrified by this attention, Sarah said. She kept the work hidden specifically because she was ashamed of wanting something beyond her roles as wife and mother and farmer. Public recognition was the last thing she would have wanted while alive. But she preserved the work, Catherine reminded her gently. She could have destroyed it if she'd truly wanted it to remain hidden forever. She could have burned the paintings, thrown away the journals, ensured the secret died with her. Instead, she left it carefully organized, left a letter explaining why she'd hidden it, trusted that you'd eventually open the barn despite her dying wish that you wouldn't. That's not the behavior of someone who wanted her work to disappear, that's someone who wanted to be seen eventually, even if she couldn't handle being seen while alive. The exhibition ran for 4 months, drawing steady attendance and generating coverage in art publications and mainstream media interested in the story of a hidden artistic life discovered after death. Critics wrote about Margaret's work with seriousness, comparing her paintings to other outsider artists and examining her technical development and emotional range. Academics wrote papers analyzing her work through various theoretical lenses, giving her paintings the kind of scholarly attention usually reserved for artists who'd spent their lives cultivating public careers within established art world structures. Major museums began acquiring pieces for their permanent collections, paying prices that shocked Sarah and Rachel, who'd grown up thinking of their mother as the practical farmer's wife who bought clothes at farm supply stores and whose idea of luxury was occasionally splurging on good quality paint brushes that she hid in the barn where nobody would wonder why she owned them. The attention transformed Margaret Bennett from family secret into cultural phenomenon, her story resonating with people far beyond the art world, rural women who saw their own hidden creative lives reflected in her experience, people who'd suppressed artistic ambitions in favor of practical responsibilities, anyone who'd ever felt that their true self existed in tension with the identity the world assigned them. Sarah and Rachel decided not to sell the farm, instead converting the Red Barn into a permanent gallery space dedicated to their mother's work. They invested money from painting sales into proper climate control and security, created a space where people could encounter Margaret's art in the context where it was created, where the relationship between her secret creative life and her public role as farmer and mother could be understood through proximity to the land and buildings that had shaped her entire existence. The main house was leased to a young family starting their agricultural operation, keeping the land working and productive while preserving the barn gallery. Rachel handled the legal and financial aspects from Denver, Sarah managed day-to-day operations, and Emma worked as informal curator during her gap year before college, learning about art and exhibition design and her grandmother's work, building a relationship with a woman she'd known only in her final years but was coming to understand deeply through the paintings she'd left behind. Emma started creating her own art too, pieces that reflected on inheritance and legacy and the ways secrets shaped families across generations, work that was distinctly her own while clearly being influenced by exposure to her grandmother's hidden production and the complex story it told about creative hunger and the cost of roles that didn't allow space for personal vision. On a warm evening in late May, 2 years after Sarah had cut the padlock and opened the barn door her mother had asked her to keep closed, she stood in the gallery space watching Emma explain one of Margaret's paintings to a group of visiting art students. Her daughter had inherited more than her grandmother's artistic talent, she'd inherited her passion, her discipline, her understanding that making art mattered even when nobody was watching, even when the world assigned you roles that didn't include space for creative work. The barn that was supposed to stay sealed forever had become a destination, a place people visited to encounter work that challenged assumptions about who made art and why, that told honest stories about creative hunger and the psychological costs of hiding fundamental parts of yourself from everyone who thought they knew you. The gallery hosted regular exhibitions, educational programs, artist residencies for people working in isolation, creating community around Margaret's legacy while honoring the solitary nature of her creative practice. Rachel visited from Denver quarterly, spending long weekends helping maintain the gallery and going through materials they hadn't yet fully cataloged. They kept finding new things, sketchbooks they'd missed initially, journals where Margaret had written about specific paintings or technical challenges, letters she drafted but never sent explaining her secret to various people at various times but apparently never found the courage to actually mail. Each discovery added new dimensions to their understanding of their mother, revealed new complexities in a woman who'd managed to be completely devoted to her family while also sustaining an intense secret creative life, who'd been both the practical farmer's wife everyone knew and the serious artist nobody suspected, who'd somehow contained multitudes without letting anyone see the full scope of who she actually was. The work had found audiences Margaret never could have imagined. Her paintings hung in major museums, graced the walls of the barn gallery she'd used for 45 years, lived in private collections where they were valued for their artistic merit rather than dismissed as hobby work created by someone whose real job was farming and motherhood. Her talent had been recognized, her dedication honored, her 45 years of secret work validated by the art world's serious attention. But beyond institutional recognition, the work continued touching individual people in ways that mattered more than critical acclaim or museum acquisitions. Sarah received letters regularly from rural women who'd visited the gallery or seen the traveling exhibition, who'd been inspired by Margaret's story to pursue their own creative interests, who'd found permission in her example to be more than one thing, to cultivate hidden talents alongside their public roles. Her mother's legacy wasn't just the paintings, it was the encouragement her story provided to other people who felt trapped by roles that didn't leave room for everything they were. 3 years after opening the barn, Sarah stood alone in the gallery on a quiet afternoon when no visitors were scheduled, looking at the portrait of herself at age 7, the piece that had first broken her heart when she discovered it among thousands of other paintings her mother had created in secret. She was 50 now, older than her mother had been when she'd painted this piece, and she understood things about Margaret's choices that she couldn't have understood at 47 when she'd first opened the barn. She understood the hunger that had driven her mother to steal hours from sleep and work, understood the shame Margaret had felt about wanting something beyond the roles assigned by family and economic necessity, understood the complex emotions that had made her keep the work secret while also preserving it carefully in case someday someone might understand what it meant. The painting showed a 7-year-old child being seen by a mother who loved her, but it also showed an artist seeing her subject with technical skill and emotional depth, showed Margaret using her daughter as inspiration for work that mattered to her in ways that went beyond maternal sentiment. Emma had children now, Sarah's grandchildren who played in the barn gallery under paintings their great-grandmother had created, who were growing up understanding that people were complicated and talent could be hidden and sometimes the most important things about someone only became visible after they were gone. The youngest, a daughter Emma had named Margaret, showed early interest in painting, spent hours studying her namesake's work, had begun creating her own pieces that suggested artistic talent spanning 4 generations. The land stretched away toward horizons that had witnessed everything, the work and the secrecy, the creation and the revelation, the dying wish that the barn stay sealed and the practical necessity that had required opening it. The soil remembered all of it, held the history of everyone who'd walked this ground, gave up its secrets when circumstances created the opportunity for revelation rather than continued concealment. Sarah locked the gallery as evening settled, walking slowly back to the farmhouse where dinner waited and Emma's family visited for the weekend. The red barn stood quiet in the gathering darkness, but it wasn't sealed anymore, wasn't forbidden, wasn't hiding secrets that could destroy someone's carefully constructed public identity. It was open, was sharing what Margaret had created, was serving as testimony to a woman who'd been more than one thing even when the world only saw one dimension of her existence. 5 years after cutting the padlock, 10 years, 15 years, time passed and the barn continued serving its purpose, continued introducing people to work that challenged assumptions and told difficult truths about creative hunger and the cost of roles that didn't allow space for personal vision. The exhibitions rotated, new scholarship emerged about Margaret's work and its place in the history of outsider art, younger generations discovered her paintings and found meaning in her story about being someone secretly while pretending to be someone else publicly. Sarah grew old in the farmhouse where she'd been raised, where her mother had lived and painted and kept secrets for 45 years, where 4 generations of Bennett women had worked the land and built lives that looked simple from outside but contained depths nobody fully understood. She maintained the gallery with Emma's help, continued sharing Margaret's story, ensured the work remained accessible to people who needed to see evidence that creative vision could be sustained even in complete isolation, even without recognition or audience or any validation beyond the personal satisfaction of making something beautiful. On a golden afternoon 20 years after cutting the padlock and opening the sealed barn, Sarah stood in the gallery looking at the portrait of herself at age 7, the piece that had first revealed her mother's hidden life and artistic talent. She was 67 now, the same age her mother had been when she'd created this painting while also managing a farm and raising 2 daughters and being the kind of wife a working farmer needed, all while keeping an entire artistic identity secret from everyone who thought they knew her. The painting looked different each time Sarah saw it, revealed new dimensions as her own understanding deepened, showed her things about her mother and herself and their relationship that could only be seen through the distance created by time and revelation and patient examination of work that had been hidden for 45 years before circumstances finally brought it to light. The barn stood as proof that some secrets were worth keeping until the right moment for revelation, that sealed doors open when practical necessity overrode dying wishes, that truth about who people really were emerged eventually regardless of how carefully it was hidden. Margaret had created in secret but she'd also created with intention, had preserved her work carefully, had left it organized and documented and ready to be discovered when her daughter finally cut through the rusted padlock and opened the door that was supposed to stay closed forever. The land breathed freely now, its secrets told, its buried truths surfaced, its testimony preserved in oil and watercolor and thousands of paintings that showed what happened when someone sustained creative vision across 45 years of secrecy. The work would outlive everyone who'd known Margaret personally, would continue speaking to people decades and centuries after her death, would serve as evidence that talent mattered regardless of recognition, that creative hunger could be sustained even without audience, that sometimes the most important truths about people only became visible when sealed doors were finally opened and secrets were brought into light that revealed their full complexity and beauty. The gallery's 25th anniversary arrived on a morning when frost painted the Iowa field silver, the landscape transformed into something that looked like one of Margaret's winter paintings from the early 90s. Sarah stood at the kitchen window of the farmhouse watching the sun rise over land that had been in her family for 4 generations, thinking about the quarter-century that had passed since she'd cut through a rusted padlock and discovered her mother's secret life rendered in thousands of paintings. She was 72 now, older than Margaret had been when she died, and the barn gallery had become something far larger than anyone had imagined that March morning when she and Emma had first opened the sealed door. What had started as a regional museum exhibition had evolved into a permanent cultural institution, a destination for people studying outsider art and women's hidden creative production, a place where Margaret Bennett's story continued resonating with new generations who found in her example permission to be more than one thing. Emma ran the gallery now, had built it into a thriving operation that included not just the permanent collection of Margaret's work but also rotating exhibitions of other artists working in isolation, educational programs for rural students interested in art, residencies for women pursuing creative work while managing family and professional obligations. She transformed her grandmother's secret into a platform that served broader purposes, that honored Margaret's legacy by creating opportunities for others facing similar tensions between creative hunger and practical responsibilities. The anniversary celebration drew people from across the country, former visitors who'd been touched by Margaret's story, artists who'd participated in residency programs, academics who'd written about her work, collectors who'd acquired pieces and wanted to see them in the context where they'd been created. But also local people, farmers and rural women who'd watched the barn transform from forbidden mystery to celebrated cultural institution, who'd seen their community's understanding of Margaret Bennett shift from practical farmer's wife to significant artist whose work deserved serious recognition. Catherine Torres came, now in her late 80s but still sharp-eyed and engaged, still writing about outsider art and hidden collections even as her own health declined. She'd been instrumental in establishing Margaret's reputation, had written the first serious critical assessment of her work, had championed her paintings when the art world might have dismissed them as amateur productions from someone who'd never studied formally or exhibited publicly during her lifetime. 25 years, Catherine said to Sarah during the reception, both women standing in the gallery surrounded by Margaret's paintings that had been hidden for 45 years before being discovered and then exhibited for a quarter century. Your mother's work has influenced an entire generation of artists and scholars thinking about creative production outside traditional structures. She's taught us that talent doesn't require institutional validation, that serious artistic vision can develop in complete isolation, that the hunger to create is sometimes strong enough to sustain decades of secret work. Sarah thought about this, about how her mother's shame about her artistic ambitions had been transformed into something that inspired others, how the secrecy that had burdened Margaret for 45 years had become part of what made her story significant to people facing similar tensions between creative desire and practical obligations. She would have been terrified by all this attention, Sarah said, gesturing around the crowded gallery. She kept the work hidden specifically because she was ashamed of wanting something beyond her roles as wife and mother and farmer. This kind of public celebration was exactly what she feared. But she preserved the work, Catherine reminded her, as she had many times over the past 25 years. She could have destroyed everything if she'd truly wanted it to remain hidden forever. Leaving it for you to find, leaving that letter explaining why she'd hidden it, that was giving permission for revelation, even if she couldn't handle it while alive. Emma found them as afternoon light shifted through the gallery windows, creating the same patterns Margaret would have seen during the thousands of hours she'd spent here painting in secret. Emma was 40 now, had built a life that balanced running the gallery with her own artistic practice, with raising two daughters who were growing up surrounded by their great-grandmother's work and the story it told about creative persistence and the cost of hiding fundamental parts of yourself. The documentary crew wants to interview you both, Emma said. They're doing a feature about the gallery's 25 years and want perspectives from 3 generations, you and Grandma Rachel about discovering the work, me about building the gallery, and Margaret and Claire about growing up in a family shaped by a secret that got revealed. The documentary would be the 3rd major film made about Margaret Bennett in 25 years, each one examining her story from different angles, each one finding new audiences who connected with various aspects of her experience. The first had focused on the discovery itself, on Sarah opening the barn and finding thousands of paintings she'd never known existed. The second had examined Margaret's artistic development, analyzing her technical evolution and emotional range across 45 years of secret production. This third would look at legacy, at how one woman's hidden creative life had influenced multiple generations and created ripples that extended far beyond her family. Rachel arrived from Denver that evening, now 66, and finally retired from her legal career, spending more time at the farm than she had in decades, reconnecting with rural roots she'd spent her adult life trying to escape. She'd been profoundly changed by discovering their mother's secret, had recognized in Margaret's hidden artistic life something of her own experience feeling trapped by roles that didn't accommodate everything she was. I spent my whole adult life running from this place, Rachel said to Sarah as they walked through the gallery after most visitors had left, both sisters surrounded by their mother's paintings that documented the farm across 45 years of secret observation. Thought rural life was limitation, thought being a farmer's daughter was something to escape. But Mom never left, never ran away, and somehow she created this. Created art that's now in major museums, that people travel across the country to see, that's influenced how we think about women's creative labor and the ways people sustain secret lives when their public roles don't leave room for personal vision. She was trapped here too, Sarah said quietly. Or felt trapped, at least. The journals make that clear. She wanted to leave sometimes, wanted to pursue art openly, wanted to be seen as an artist rather than just a farmer's wife. But she stayed, partly because leaving wasn't economically feasible, partly because she loved Dad and us in the land, partly because she couldn't figure out how to be both the artist she needed to be and the mother and wife we needed her to be. They stood in front of a self-portrait from 1995, Margaret at 51, her face showing the weathering of agricultural life but her eyes containing complexity that suggested she knew exactly who she was even if nobody else did. The painting was remarkable for its honesty. Margaret hadn't flattered herself, hadn't hidden the evidence of hard physical labor and stress and aging, but she'd also captured something else, some essential quality that transcended the practical farmer's wife everyone saw when they looked at her. She was both people simultaneously, Rachel said. The practical woman who ran the farm and raised us, and the artist who created all this in secret. Not one masking the other, but both existing genuinely, both being true even though one was visible and one was hidden. Emma's younger daughter Margaret, 14 now and called Maggie to distinguish her from her great-grandmother, had been spending the day sketching visitors to the gallery, creating quick portraits that showed inherited talent and observational skill that spanned 4 generations. She approached her mother and aunt shyly, holding her sketchbook, asking if they wanted to see what she'd drawn. The sketches were remarkable for someone her age, quick but confident, capturing not just physical appearance but something about each person's character or mood. One showed an elderly woman standing in front of one of Margaret Bennett's landscapes, the viewer's face showing emotion that suggested personal connection to the work. Another captured a young couple examining a painting together, their body language suggesting relationship dynamics that went beyond simple shared activity. "These are really good, Maggie," Sarah said, genuinely impressed by her great-granddaughter's skill. "You've inherited your great-grandmother's eye for seeing people, for capturing something essential about them." Maggie blushed but looked pleased. "I want to be an artist like her. Not hiding it though. I want people to see what I make." "That's exactly what she would have wanted," Emma said, putting her arm around her daughter. "For you to have the courage she couldn't find, to be visible in ways she couldn't manage, to create openly instead of in secret." The anniversary celebration continued through the weekend, bringing together people whose lives had been touched by Margaret's work in various ways. Art students came who'd written dissertations about her paintings. Collectors came who owned pieces and wanted to share stories about living with her work. Rural women came who'd been inspired by her example to pursue their own creative interests despite practical obligations that might have prevented it. One woman, maybe 60, approached Sarah during the final reception with tears in her eyes and a story she'd been carrying for years. "I saw the original exhibition in Kansas City 25 years ago, right after it opened. I was 35. Mother of 3, working as a rural mail carrier, convinced I'd never have time for the painting I'd loved as a teenager. Your mother's story gave me permission to try anyway, to steal hours the way she did, to take my creative desires seriously even when my life was full of other obligations." She pulled out her phone, showed Sarah photographs of paintings she'd created over the past 25 years, landscapes and portraits and abstract pieces that showed serious talent developed through persistent practice. "I've never exhibited publicly, never tried to sell anything, never pursued it as anything more than personal satisfaction. But I've painted consistently for 25 years because your mother's example taught me that creating matters even when nobody's watching, that artistic vision doesn't require audience or validation, that the work itself is enough." Sarah heard stories like this throughout the weekend, variations on the theme of people finding permission in Margaret's example to pursue creative work despite obligations that might have prevented it. Her mother had spent 45 years ashamed of her artistic ambitions, had died believing the work should stay hidden, had been too burdened by guilt and shame to share her talent while alive. But in death, that hidden work had become something that inspired others, that gave permission, that demonstrated possibilities for sustaining creative vision alongside practical responsibilities. Monday morning brought quiet after the celebration weekend, the gallery empty except for Sarah and Emma cleaning up from the reception, both of them moving through spaces that had become more familiar than their own homes. Sarah found herself in front of the portrait of herself at age 7, the piece she'd returned to countless times over 25 years, finding new meanings each time she looked at it. "Do you ever wish she'd told us?" Emma asked, joining her mother in front of the painting. "That she'd shared this with you while she was alive, let you see this part of her instead of keeping it secret until after death?" Sarah considered this carefully, a question she'd asked herself thousands of times over a quarter century. Yes and no. Yes, because knowing would have made our relationship more complete, would have let me see her as she actually was instead of just the parts she felt safe showing. But also no, because the secrecy is part of what makes the work significant, part of what makes her story resonate with people facing similar tensions between creative desire and practical obligations. If she'd exhibited openly, if she'd pursued art as a public identity, the work would be good but the story wouldn't have the power it does. So her shame and secrecy became part of her legacy, Emma said slowly, working through an idea she'd been developing for years. The hiding became as important as the work itself, became part of what makes her example meaningful to people who also feel like they have to hide parts of themselves. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, straightening displays and resetting the gallery for regular operations, both of them reflecting on 25 years of sharing Margaret's secret with the world. The barn that was supposed to stay sealed forever had become one of the region's most significant cultural institutions, drawing thousands of visitors annually, generating scholarship and exhibitions and programs that extended far beyond the original paintings that had started everything. That evening, Sarah sat on the farmhouse porch watching sunset paint the sky in colors her mother had captured hundreds of times across 45 years of painting this landscape in different weathers and seasons. The land stretched away toward horizons that had witnessed 4 generations of Bennett women, each one shaped by this place in different ways, each one finding their own relationship with legacy and obligation and the tension between staying and leaving. Margaret had stayed, had cultivated her secret creative life while being devoted mother and wife and farmer, had found a way to be multiple things simultaneously even though showing the world her full complexity would have required courage she couldn't muster. Sarah had left and then returned, had built a life in Des Moines that had nothing to do with farming but had come back after her mother's death to deal with the property and had discovered the sealed barn that rewrote everything she believed about the woman who'd raised her. Emma had chosen to stay, to build her life here, to transform the barn gallery into her career and calling, to raise her daughters surrounded by their great-grandmother's work and the questions it raised about creative hunger and the cost of hiding fundamental parts of yourself. And now Maggie was growing up here too, 4th-generation Bennett woman on this land, carrying forward artistic talent that had been hidden for 45 years, then revealed, then celebrated, then transformed into something that served purposes beyond just one woman's secret creative life. Rachel joined Sarah on the porch as darkness settled, both sisters quiet with their own thoughts about their mother and the 25 years since discovering her secret. They'd processed so much over that quarter century, shock and grief and pride and anger and admiration and sadness about what Margaret had hidden and why she'd hidden it and what it had cost her to sustain secret creative work while being everything her family needed her to be. "I found another journal in the house yesterday," Rachel said finally. "Was going through boxes in the attic and found a notebook from 2000, year before Dad died. She wrote about feeling like she was disappearing, like the roles she played were consuming who she actually was, like without the painting she'd be nothing but wife and mother and farmer with no self separate from those functions." "Did she write about us? About feeling guilty for wanting something beyond motherhood?" "Yeah. There's a passage about watching you visit with your family, seeing you living your independent life in Des Moines, feeling proud that you'd escaped but also feeling trapped herself, feeling like she couldn't leave because too many people depended on her staying and being the practical woman they needed." Rachel paused. She wrote that the painting was the only thing that was completely hers, the only part of her life where she made choices based on personal desire rather than obligation or responsibility to others. Sarah felt tears rising, moved by this evidence of her mother's struggle even 25 years after discovering the sealed barn. Margaret had loved them, had been devoted to her family, but she'd also needed something separate from them, something that was hers alone. The tension between those needs had shaped her entire adult life, had created the secrecy that had burdened her for 45 years and had also created the legacy that had touched so many lives over the past quarter century. The stars appeared in patterns Margaret had painted dozens of times, the night sky rendered in oils and watercolors and passionate brushstrokes that captured both visual reality and emotional resonance. Sarah thought about her mother standing in this same spot, looking at these same stars, carrying secrets nobody suspected while being the devoted wife and mother everyone thought they knew completely. Time continued its steady progression. The gallery's 30th anniversary came and went, then its 35th. Sarah passed 80, Rachel nearing it, both sisters slowing down but still involved with the gallery that had become the center of their lives in ways they never could have predicted when they were children, being raised by a woman they thought was just a practical farmer's wife. Emma turned 50, her daughters both in their 20s now. Maggie had gone to art school, was building a career as a painter whose work engaged with themes of visibility and hiding, of secret lives and public identities, of inheritance and legacy and the ways family stories shaped artistic vision. Her work was distinctly her own but clearly influenced by growing up surrounded by her great-grandmother's paintings, by understanding from childhood that people were complicated and that sometimes the most important things about someone only became visible after they died. The gallery had expanded over the decades, acquiring the old equipment barn and converting it into additional exhibition space, creating a campus that included not just Margaret's work but also archives documenting her life, research facilities for scholars studying outsider art and women's creative production, studios where artists and residents could work in isolation while being supported by community and resources. Major retrospectives of Margaret's work traveled to museums across the country, each one introducing new audiences to her paintings and her story, each one generating more scholarship and criticism and appreciation for what she'd accomplished in secret over 45 years. Her reputation had solidified. She was no longer just an interesting discovery or a touching story, but a recognized significant artist whose work deserved serious attention regardless of how it had been created or how long it had remained hidden. On a golden afternoon 40 years after Sarah had cut the padlock and opened the sealed barn, she stood in the gallery for what she knew might be the last time. She was 87, her health declining, her body failing in ways that made clear she didn't have much time left. Emma had driven her from the hospital where she'd been receiving treatment, had brought her to the gallery at Sarah's request because she wanted to see her mother's work one more time, wanted to stand in the space where Margaret had created in secret for 45 years. She moved slowly through the gallery, Emma supporting her gently, both of them quiet as they walked past paintings Sarah had seen thousands of times but which still revealed new dimensions each time she looked at them. The portrait of herself at age 7 had been loaned to a museum in New York, so she couldn't see it today, but she could picture it perfectly, the careful attention her mother had paid to capturing her expression, the love evident in every brushstroke, the way Margaret had seen her daughter and preserved that seeing through artistic labor nobody had known was happening. "I'm glad I opened the barn," Sarah said finally, her voice weak but clear. "Even though it meant breaking the promise I made to her when she was dying, even though she asked me specifically not to open it. I'm glad I cut the lock and went inside and found all of this." "She wanted you to find it," Emma said gently. "That's why she preserved it, why she left the letter, why she made the promise so specific that you'd eventually have practical reasons to break it. She couldn't share it while alive, but she made sure it would be discovered after death." They stood together in front of one of Margaret's final paintings, created just months before her diagnosis, showing the farm at sunset with light that looked like it was painted by someone saying goodbye. Sarah thought about her mother spending 45 years in this barn, stealing hours to create beauty while being everything her family needed her to be, sustaining secret creative work that wouldn't be recognized until after she died. "Do you think she's at peace now?" Sarah asked. "Knowing that the work was found, that it's been celebrated, that her story has helped other people pursue creative work they might have suppressed?" Emma was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think she would still be terrified by the attention, still feel ashamed that she wanted something beyond her roles as wife and mother and farmer. But I also think she'd be proud that the work mattered, that it influenced people, that hiding it for 45 years didn't mean it was lost forever." Sarah died 3 months later, peacefully at the farmhouse where she'd been raised, where her mother had lived and painted and kept secrets for 45 years. Emma organized a memorial service at the gallery, filling it with people whose lives had been touched by Margaret's work and by Sarah's decision to honor her mother's legacy by sharing what she'd hidden. Rachel spoke about her sister's courage in opening the barn despite their mother's dying wish that it stay sealed, about the choice to share the work publicly rather than keeping it as family secret, about the decades Sarah had devoted to ensuring Margaret's paintings received the recognition they deserved. "Sarah broke a promise to honor a deeper truth," Rachel said, her voice thick with grief. She understood that sometimes respecting the dead means not following their explicit wishes, means seeing beyond their fears and shame to what they actually needed, means having courage they couldn't find while alive. The gallery continued under Emma's direction, growing and evolving as new generations discovered Margaret Bennett's story and found in it meaning relevant to their own struggles between creative desire and practical obligation. Maggie eventually took over daily operations, becoming the fourth generation of Bennett women to manage the barn that had been sealed for 45 years before being transformed into a cultural institution. The land endured, the soil holding memories of everyone who'd worked it, the buildings standing as testament to persistence and transformation. The red barn that Margaret had used for secret creative work stood solid, its structure maintained carefully, its purpose clear, to preserve and share work that demonstrated how artistic vision could be sustained even in complete isolation, how talent didn't require validation or audience, how the hunger to create was sometimes strong enough to overcome shame and fear and all the practical reasons why someone might suppress their artistic ambitions. Margaret's paintings hung in museums around the world, graced the walls of the barn gallery where they'd been created, lived in private collections and public institutions, serving as evidence that she'd been a remarkable artist whose work deserved recognition regardless of how long it had remained hidden. But more than that, they served as testimony to complexity of human lives, to the ways people could be multiple things simultaneously, to truth that roles and public presentations were often just fractions of complete truth about who someone actually was. The story passed into local legend, then regional history, then became part of broader cultural understanding about women's creative labor and the psychological costs of hiding fundamental parts of yourself. Students studied Margaret's work in art history classes, scholars wrote dissertations about her technical development and emotional range, casual visitors came to the barn gallery drawn by curiosity about a woman who'd painted in secret for 45 years. On a cool morning 50 years after Sarah had cut the padlock, half a century after the discovery that had changed everything, Emma's granddaughter stood in the gallery giving a tour to visiting art students. She was 23, looked remarkably like Margaret had in old photographs from that age, had inherited the artistic talent and serious demeanor that seemed to run through 4 generations of Bennett women. "My great-great-grandmother created all of this in secret," she told the students, gesturing around the gallery at paintings that documented 45 years of hidden creative work. She was ashamed of wanting something beyond her roles as wife and mother and farmer, felt guilty about spending time on art instead of exclusively focusing on family and work obligations. But she couldn't stop creating, couldn't suppress the hunger to make something beautiful, so she did it in secret for 45 years while presenting to the world the image of someone who had no interest in such frivolous pursuits. The students asked questions. Why had she hidden it? What had happened when the family discovered her secret? How had the work gone from sealed barn to celebrated cultural institution? Emma's granddaughter answered patiently, telling the story that had been told thousands of times over 50 years, finding new meanings in a narrative that had shaped her entire life. The barn stood as proof that some secrets were worth keeping until the right moment for revelation, that sealed doors open when circumstances demanded it, that truth about who people actually were emerged eventually regardless of how carefully it was hidden. Margaret had died believing her work should stay concealed, but she'd also left it carefully preserved and organized, had written a letter explaining why she'd hidden it, had given permission for discovery even while explicitly asking that the barn remain sealed. The land stretched away toward horizons that had witnessed 5 generations now, the soil holding stories that went back beyond living memory, the fields bearing witness to everything that had happened here. The farm continued being worked by tenants who respected its history, the gallery continued drawing visitors from around the world, and the story continued resonating with new generations who found in Margaret Bennett's example something that spoke to their own struggles between creative desire and practical obligation. The final paragraph of the 1000th scholarly article written about Margaret Bennett's work ended with an observation that had become almost cliché through repetition but remained true. In choosing to preserve her work while also keeping it secret, Margaret Bennett demonstrated understanding that some legacies are worth protecting even when shame prevents their revelation during one's lifetime. The barn that housed her secret creative life for 45 years has become a place where thousands of people have found permission to pursue their own hidden talents, making Margaret's legacy about more than just the paintings she created but also about the courage required to be fully yourself even when the world assigns you roles that don't accommodate everything you are. The words were academic, careful, measured, exactly the kind of serious critical attention Margaret never could have imagined her work receiving. But they also captured something essential about what she'd created and what it meant, about how her shame and secrecy and courage and talent had combined to produce something that mattered not just aesthetically but culturally, not just as art but as testimony to the complexity of human lives lived in tension between public roles and private hungers. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.